because there was a certain level of, community that's involved in making the print, because you generally can't do it on your own. You're always going to be in an environment with kind of others, or with a technician, or there are going to be technical challenges. So I think the whole kind of community of print is also, I think, an important thing.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 64th episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Lime on Instagram and Facebook, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter with print news from around the world, all at pinecopperlime.com. We also have a Patreon page where, if you like our little podcast and you have $1 or $2 you can send our way each month, it makes a world of difference to us. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. This episode of Pine Copper Lime is brought to you by our sponsor, Speedball Art Products, who've been bringing a diverse range of high-quality products to your creative practice since 1997. Their newest exciting initiative is Speedball's Print Posse. Working with contemporary printmaking icons, Speedball has invited each artist to design and name an ink of their choosing. Artists like Bill Fick, who worked with Speedball to design his vibrant shade of relief ink, Revolution Red. Fick is known for his super graphic narrative prints that deal with a variety of satirical and socio-political themes, while bridging the gap between fine and lowbrow art. Fick's shade of Revolution Red is a bold punch of color, perfect for getting things started. For more on Speedball's Print Posse, or to find out where you can pick up a can of your new favorite ink, check out speedballart.com. My guest this week is Faisal Abdu'Allah, who is known for his ambitious and political installation art pieces, which utilize photography and printmaking. We'll talk about his childhood growing up in London as the son of Jamaican immigrants, the place of the Barbershop in his Afro-British community, and how it left that indelible mark on his art practice. We also chat about why media and process are so integral to his ideas and how he centers community in his exhibitions. Faisal also happens to be the current president of the Southern Graphics Council International, and we'll get a first-hand account of how that organization is adapting to 2020 and the future of our beloved conferences. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to get out the clippers with Faisal Abdu'Allah. Hi Faisal, how's it going?
Hi, Miranda. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me on your 8 a.m. and my 8 p.m. I think that works out well, and I'm glad we got to connect.
Absolutely. I mean, my day's just beginning while yours is coming to a close, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as I was saying before we started recording, I just got to fight my way through Bangkok traffic and pouring down rain and flooding, and I'm very happy to be back in my apartment and getting a chance to have a chat with you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the evening is the kind of golden time for me, especially as I see the sunset, and I get very thoughtful on the days of. Yeah, and I think it's the same in the morning when I get up, and I try to get up with the sun. And again, very thoughtful as I see the sun rising to think about, what is that day going to bring and what are the things I want to try and achieve, what are going to be the tasks and what are going to be the hurdles. So yeah. I think there are two parts of, I would say, entry and departure, I think.
For sure. It's crepuscular, I think, is the name of the times. And I've always liked that word particularly. And people sometimes see it in art history with crepuscular rays or those, old master dramatic rays coming in. So yeah, I'm glad we got to connect in our crepuscular times. And, I know you from just your reputation and the print world, and I know that we've connected here and there at SGCI conferences. But for anyone who's listening in who may not be familiar with your work, how
Sure.
would you go about describing who you are and where you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name's Faisal Abdu'Allah. I'm a professor at UW-Madison, and I'm in the print department, printmaking area. And I was born and raised in London and had my education, formal education in London at Royal College of Art and Central St. Martin's. And I've been making my work for about 20 plus years. And the work that I create is, that looks at, faith and kind of history, myth, memory, violence. And it's a practice primarily rooted in kind of printmaking, but it has many facets. And I guess my kind of main drive is to look at ways of using material, ways of using the multiple, and thinking about very relevant issues and themes that primarily have affected my own evolution as a person. So there are issues that look at kind of race, issues that look at, I would say, representation, and the human subject. And some of the works that I've created have utilized, I would say, materials. For example, I've worked with glass, I've worked with gold, I make sculptures. So some people are a bit bemused when they say, "Oh, you're trained as a printmaker, but you make objects, but you make photographs, you do performances." So I say my practice is extremely broad in its approach, and the early works were based around my experience of living in London, and then the later works that I've made in the last sort of 7 years have been based through the lens of living in the US.
And where are you located currently in the United States?
So I'm currently in Madison, Wisconsin, right in the middle, the Midwest. And it's great because, I'm 8 hours either side of, another major of the East Coast and the West Coast. Right. And, and I think the Midwest, has its own history. It's a long-standing history with printmaking, and a long-standing kind of history in kind of civil rights, especially on the UW campus. So there's a lot of things that I'm able to tease from this community since I've been here in the last sort of 7 years.
Yeah. And so you mentioned growing up in London. Can you talk just a little bit more about that time for you and what role art played in your life?
Yes, when I was a young kid, I was the last child of 8. And, my sisters would say that I'm the one that's spoiled, who was able to have a career in the arts. Mm. And my father, he was a church minister. So I would, see my father every, once a week, make supplications and speak to pictures. And one of the things he would do, he would speak to a picture on the wall of Jesus, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. And he would say, "Dear Jesus, protect my family." And as a young kid, I was bewildered by the reverie that he would give to this image. And then what I would also do, I would draw a lot on the dining table, because it was a way that I created a lot of space around me. And coupled with that, once a month, we'd go to the local barbershop, which would be in somebody's home. So my parents came to the UK from Jamaica in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. Racial tension was high in London, and the black communities were formed because relationships were made earlier in the so-called Commonwealth countries like Jamaica, Barbados. Mm. So a lot of these men would convene in these homes, and they were already friends. And I was young, and they always say children are seen and not heard. And I would sit and watch the barber hold court in the back of his room, and he'd be literally sculpting the shape and form around these people's heads. But I was really interested by the whole play of people in the corner playing dominoes, somebody over there smoking a cigar, somebody having a conversation about a liaison at the weekend. And for me, watching this informal educational space. So I always cited as the barbershop space within Mr. Wright's home in London as the first place where I learned what it meant to understand my own identity as a young person. And then as I began to draw and paint and began to somehow reflect some of those stories in my primary class, my teachers began to understand that there was some, potential, there was some capacity for them to support the work that I was doing. And my parents didn't get it because they felt, you're academically smart. We want you to go to be a lawyer. That was the thing. So I guess I just kept drawing as a way of almost talking about that moment of the sunrise, the sunset moment, where there was a way that I could find some solace, a way that I could escape, and a way that I could almost create these imaginary places and spaces. And when I went to secondary school, you get to the point when you get to 16 where you make your options to say, these are the subjects I want to major in. And I chose art, and obviously my parents made me choose other subjects, biology, physics. Did very well in those subjects. And my art teacher, Mr. May, entered me into the art exam early. And I got really, really, I got a pass, got a really strong pass in it. And then I think the following day, he took 3 of us to the National Portrait Gallery in London, in Trafalgar Square. And he put us in the back of his old Ford Capri. I mean, nowadays that would never happen.
Right.
He was like a hippie. He took these young guys to the National Portrait Gallery. We got out, and as I walked in, it was almost like this. It's almost like I'd arrived, because I'd seen all of these paintings in books. Because we never had internet in the 80s. It was I'd seen these paintings in books in my art class. I had to copy these paintings, from exercises from Mr. May. So I was looking at, Paul Rubens. I was looking at Degas. I was looking at so many of the works that I'd only seen in books. But there was something about the place and space that felt right. It felt extremely comfortable, and I guess that was one of the I would say the first seminal moment of kind of belonging and feeling as if there was a form of natural selection. And then I think it was about 3 months later, he said to me, your applications are coming up for going to your degree. I'm assuming, we're going to get your portfolio together. It was almost like he had already created the conversation that I was going to apply to art school.
Yeah.
I looked at him bemused and I said, me to art school? I mean, I'm like 17 years old, the first in my, family to go to university, or potentially. And my teacher's telling me that I'm going to go to art school. My teacher's going to go crazy. He's actually going to lose his mind. So, the applications came up and everything then was done again by phone and post. So I think it was sometime I can't remember when it was. It might have been March or April. My father summoned me to the kitchen and he says, so you're going to do the application now and apply to medical school or law school. And I said, yes, Dad. And him and my dad and I think my cousin was at the house, and they chaperoned, they walked me to the telephone, the old school telephone that was plugged into the wall. And you had to dial it. So anyone that doesn't know what a dial-up phone looks like, I had to dial the number. So I dialed the school and the university, and it was a summer. And I think nobody picked up the phone. So they left the room, and then I dialed the art school, and they picked up, and I asked them, could they send me the application form? So I guess, unbeknownst to my father, I applied to the art school. They sent me the notice for an interview. Mr. May and Mr. McClements helped me put my portfolio together. And I applied to 3 schools, and went for the interview. And it felt like jazz. It was like an informal conversation. They were asking me really kind of left field questions. And there I was, this bright 17-year-old kid. And I got 3 offers. And I couldn't believe it. And I think it was from that point on, I kind of answered the calling and did my foundation in art at Harrow School of Art. And Harrow School of Art is in West London, and it's very close to Harrow Boys School, where Winston Churchill went and David Cameron went. It's a very famous public school. And then that was for 1 year. And then I applied for my BA, and I applied to Central St. Martin's. And again, very, very competitive to get in. And I applied for printmaking, because when I was on my foundation, you do all the aspects of of art. It's a foundation for 1 year. So I did fashion, I did graphics, I did painting, and I dabbled in printmaking. And when I was choosing for a course to apply to, my professor says, "What are you applying for?" And I says, "Graphic design." And she went, "You're not a graphic designer." And she literally laughed at me. I said, "Why? So why can't I do graphics?" She said, "No, you are a printmaker." She says, "Printmaker?" I said, "I've done it, but I don't want to do printmaking. I don't want to print newspapers." And she went, "No, it's not printing newspapers." Again, I was 17, naive. And she literally, took my hand and took me to the library and showed me, a lot of the kind of work and the ways in which print manifests itself in the world. And then she said to me, "Look, apply to Central St. Martin's. It's the best printmaking course in the country. I think you might do well." And I applied and I got into Central St. Martin's, and it completely transformed my life. And the BA at St. Martin's was 3 years. And then after that, I applied for the master's. As you grow as a student, you begin to understand the network of the art educational system. And at the time, there were 3 major art schools in London, and there still is: the Royal College of Art, the Slade School of Art, Royal Academy. And I applied to both. I applied to the Royal College of Art and the Slade. And the interesting thing was, back then, they would have interviews around about the same time, and they would almost, they would compete for the students. And I got into the Royal College, and I think the week later, I had the interview at the Slade. And when I went for the interview at the Slade, they said, "Well, if you get into the Royal College, will you come to here?" And I said, "Of course I'll come to the Slade. Of course I'll." And it's funny because I had a friend who was on the interview panel, and she called me up and says, "You're not going to get into the Slade." And I said, "Why?" She said, "They think you're going to get into the Royal College. You're going to turn them down. So they're not going to offer you a place." And I think it was like a week later, I got the letter from the Slade, but I hadn't heard from the Royal College, and I was a little bit nervous.
Oh, man.
But it was fine. I got in, and then, the Royal College was 2 years. And then after that, I continued to make my work as an artist. And the Royal College was an amazing experience because I studied at the same time as David Adjaye, or Sir David Adjaye now, Johannes Verkeller, Chris O'Feely, Sue Stockwell, Hugh Locke. I mean, these are all amazing people. So the Royal College was an amazing time between 1991 and 1993.
How do you think that your mentor knew you were a printmaker? What was it about you or your practice that you think she could just spot you as one of us?
I mean, when I think about it now, I have this kind of blueprint in my head about 3 stages of practice. And it's like the thinking, the making, and the dissemination. And I think that, the process of making work is almost like ritualistic. So, I have ideas, and the ideas come from things that I've seen or experienced, or things that I've tasted, or things that have touched me, or things that don't sit well with me. And then I find a vehicle to have those things speak through. And what I found when I was working in the print studio, working with, screen and working with this. So I felt that screen printing, for example, had a certain kind of speed attached to it. So my ideas were able to come very, very quickly, and each one was a version of the other. So there was a certain pace and a certain kind of application that working with a particular kind of process in printmaking really impacted the way that I was making. And then when I would do etching, for example, which is a lot slower and a lot more timely and a lot more thoughtful, the work was more timely and thoughtful. Mm-hmm. And when I was thinking about ideas that had a certain kind of scale or something that needed to be potentially made 3-dimensional, again, it was always dictated, by the medium. So it was almost like, the way I could describe it is when I did a piece a few years ago, and it was called Dula 69. And it was a series of photographic etchings. And somebody said to me, "Why didn't they just make them as photographs? Because they look like, medium format, black and white photographs." But I says, no. The process of etching is really integral to this work, because what it does is the portrait of 11 people's stories of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And they were talking about being deconstructed and reconstructed through their own self-healing. And when I took their photograph, each photograph at a certain time of the day, at a certain point, when I was in Joburg for a residency, I then had the images placed onto a plate. And I said, when the plate goes into the acid, that's when they're deconstructed. That's when they're attacked by this medium. That's when they almost become a negative. They don't kind of exist. And then when I take them out of the acid and rinse them in water, it almost like they become in that state of neutrality. And then the inking of the plate is the reviving of them. And then for me, and then the paper, when it hits the surface and it pulls them off, it almost like pulls them back to life, like the resurrection happens. And that's how I've always felt about working in print, that it's more than just a process. It's a very bodily thing. And I think I felt that in the first instance when I was working on my foundation and working in the print studio, because I was painting at the same time, I was making sculptures, but there was something that really pulled me. And maybe it was because of my spiritual centering as a young person growing up, and always being very mindful of, just meditating and very mindful of my environment, and always thinking about, material and how people somehow can imbue a sense of spirituality in objects. So I think that's my kind of introductory into the printmaking world, I guess.
Yeah, and that repetitive nature of printmaking is so much like meditation, I think, for a lot of people. And just like doing the rosary or something, or chanting it has that quality of taking oneself out of oneself. Yeah.
And I think when I teach my students and they come into the class and some of them are doing print for the first time, and I say to them, the first print that was ever made is all of you in this room. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, you are all a version of your parents. And then they kind of look and they just can't imagine what this British professor talking about. Again, it's just about thinking, it's just saying about the idea of, repetition and the multiple. And I think that is the beauty of why I think printmakers, are probably the far most interesting people that I speak to, because, that work manifests in so many different ways. It manifests outside of the, in public space. I think it functions on three-dimensional forms. It functions because we have the capacity to have things disintegrate, because sometimes, because it's a multiple, we can create this thing and then set it on fire, because that's what we need to do. So I love the complexity and the bandwidth that which printmakers can function and how their mind functions, because there is a certain level of, community that's involved in making the print, because you generally can't do it on your own. You're always going to be in an environment with kind of others, or with a technician, or there are going to be technical challenges. So I think the whole kind of community of print is also, I think, an important thing.
Yeah, my mind is still sort of like stuck on this idea of like humans as prints, and I just have these images in my head of grainy videos from biology class of cells just splitting and splitting and splitting and copying, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like that's what we all are. That's the sort of fundamental nature of creation. That's so interesting. So I would say, speaking of communities, I know a lot of your work actually engages with communities, and that I think that I've heard you speak about your exhibitions in I think a really interesting way, in terms of how it's not a passive, you're an artist who's created something and the work exists when someone has come and consumed it, but rather that like actually through the viewing, the work is given meaning and the work is given life. And I know that we're all living in a time when community consumption of art is a little bit more difficult, but I'm hoping that you can sort of speak to your philosophies around that, and maybe in this time when we're all kind of having a little breather for it, give some people sort of inspiration about different creative ways they can think about how they're going to engage community once we're able to do that again.
Yeah, no, I think for me, the community has always been something that has been in my core, and I always think it's important to try and be your kind of authentic self. So just to recap on one of the projects I did at Stanford, where it was two people who had this amazing understanding relationship with each other. And I asked them, is there anybody in their life that they trust implicitly? And they both said each other. And I said, no, I need to have somebody else's name. And each person gave me a name. And then those two people, I took their portrait and asked them to summon the person to my studio. When those two people came at different times, I said to them, you've been summoned because you're trusted implicitly by this individual. And a complete, veil of joy came over them. And then I took that and I said, do you mind if I take your portrait, for the project? And they said, sure. Then I asked them the same question. And then it went on. And then each line, the first line had 10 people, the second line had 10 people. And then I created this 30-foot photograph that had each person that person had recommended on their left-hand side. It was this 30-foot portrait, and it was called 10 Degrees of Separation. And it was a project that was started by these two people. And it's almost like they were the kind of the authors of it through their line of logic. And, for me telling them that I'm going to create this piece and hopefully have it in a major show in a year and a half time, they didn't believe me. These are young, brilliant students at Stanford. And it was so beautiful to have the thing made. And then I sent both of them books of the show. And I think doing a project with a community, a lot of artists parachute themselves in, don't get to know the community, and then leave once they've got what they have. So for me, it's really important that the community are always the brains in the work. They contribute to the work. And in some ways, if they can help augment the work, I think that's really important. I think in the time of COVID, I think I have seen and I've witnessed a lot of unkind words, shared by people and I understand it, because I understand that if you are in a space where you're on your own and all you have is the information from social media, then it's really going to somehow, augment and shift the way that you kind of potentially look at self and look at others. And what I've done, recently is, so for example, when I was working with my students in the first 6 weeks of lockdown, I mean, printmaking is a physical act. And I'm given the task of trying to create physical work, and students do not have a studio. So it's me trying to teach somebody to swim in a desert. It's actually impossible. But what I could say to them as a community is that they are part of a community that has, and this has never happened in a generation. And I said to them that I want to use this class for us to actually make a book. And what you are going to do as individuals is start to craft some kind of language. You're going to begin to craft some kind of images. And every week, this project was almost like a check-in. So for me, the class is 2.5 hours, but we only needed to meet for like 45 minutes. And then it turned out that everyone was almost like presenting their segment of this kind of book, or a part of the book that they wanted to contribute to. And then we slowly began to shape the book virtually. So I found somebody in the class who could design. I found somebody in the class who wanted to work on the edits. So I gave them, creative control of the project. So even though I am the professor in the class, I've assembled a team of people in the class with certain duties. And when it came to the second to last class, I presented this finished virtual book, and they were like, you could see how emotionally they became, seeing that there was this book that they had created that talked purely about this time in isolation. And I said, what I'm also going to do, we're going to get them printed, and I'm going to send each one of you the physical book. And for me, it's been beautiful just to actually get these 12 physical books and then post them out to the students, because it was their work. And for me, I just think it's in this time of uncertainty, this is where artists really flourish. I think this is when we really have to, maybe hold a mirror up to society again. And maybe it's not always clear. And we're going to do things that maybe are not going to be seen in the best light. But if we're able to reassess them and admit our failings and say sorry, and keep moving forward. I think that's one of the keys. So for me, working with those communities and helping them to augment things that are physical and finding ways of them being able to have these physical things. Because I'm slightly paranoid about the virtual world. I like to have physical things I can touch. And so now we have 12 students out there that have this book. They all have a book each. And in that book, their name is in that book. And in that book, there is an introduction where I just talk about the time of COVID. And they are the first generation of young people to have school suspended and be working remotely. Yeah. And I said to them, imagine this. In 20 years' time, you're going to be sitting in a bar somewhere. And maybe a young person sitting next to you who is the same age as you now. And they're going to say, 20 years ago, there was this thing called COVID. And I don't know what these students did. And you're going to say you lived through that. And you're also going to be able to show them testimony in this physical book that you had crafted with your other 11 colleagues in that class. And you're going to hold those people's names very dear to you because you don't realize how important this moment is. So I just think it's just important that if we're able to work kind of collectively and create wonderful things that can have some kind of sustained life, that another generation can come in and see the words or read the words or see the images or somehow participate in what you were going through. And I think that's the only way that I can kind of describe it.
Absolutely. And that, while of course there are artists who create things digitally now, or ephemeral in other ways like music in the past, one of the things that really struck me when I was an art historian and I was studying 16th century printmaking was just how the artifacts that we have from the past are almost really entirely art. And of course, there are some, every once in a while, some historian will find a ledger for a 17th century, Dutch firehouse, and it will be their smoking gun for their thesis. But the things that people have chosen to preserve and pass down and chosen to privilege as precious are art. It's writing and it's pictures that people have drawn and created. And so in terms of physicality and in terms of how we are placing ourselves in history, I think it's really beautiful that you're making sure that there are physical objects because, there are already just, since the 1980s, things that are lost because there's no real technology around that's accessible to be able to read them. And of course, this is only going to increase. And we are living, as the saying goes, in unprecedented times. And, really thinking consciously in this bird's eye view about how we're marking this and how we're going to be able to communicate this extremely intense and confusing time is something that I think everyone should be doing really consciously. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think to add on to that point is working collectively with communities, they then become also collaborators in the work. So it's not only me. And I always make a point of, when I'm working with communities and that work is shown, their names are shown alongside my name within the work. Mm-hmm. So there are these bodies of works that exist out there that have these co-authors. So hopefully in years to come, when that work is seen, then they'll see these other names and understand that, not only one artist tells the story, because I think artists are the shapers of social consciousness, and what they have shaped sometimes has not been good. I went out to galleries when I was young and I would see, paintings when I was young of bodies that looked like mine, but in subservient positions or being maimed. And that generally was the kind of the representation that I would see. And in a way, I made a contract with myself to ensure that I would change that. And I would make a small contribution in changing the representation of bodies like mine in visual culture.
Well, I know that, one of the pieces that first, I think, started to get you a lot of attention was it, I I'm sorry. I want to kill Sam. Is
You
that
got
it?
it.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I want to kill Sam. And so I guess speaking of bodies and how they're represented, I feel like this would be a great time maybe to speak about that piece, because it also seems like it's just as pertinent, if not more so now, 30 years on.
Yeah. I mean, I Want to Kill Sam is one of the pieces that people really picked up on, and I guess it was me. I think the works that I create, somehow annotate my my life, I guess. And I Want to Kill Sam came at a time when I was questioning my own identity as a young man, as I was being informed by rappers. I was listening to people like KRS-One and Lakeem Shabazz, very very conscious rappers. Do the Right Thing had come out. I was reading Malcolm X. And the first thing I checked in was my name, because my name prior to Faisal was Paul Anthony Duffus. And I would say to myself, Duffus is a Scottish name. I mean, what I don't look Scottish. Well, I could look Scottish, but I don't sound Scottish. And my parents are from Jamaica. So how did my parents from Jamaica end up with a Scottish name? So the more and more I began to do all that research, I began to realize that there needs to be a shift, because for me, a good name is better than silver and gold. And I wanted to, so my name changed. I embraced Islam and changed the name. And I Want to Kill Sam was almost, reflective and indicative of a consciousness that was happening in London. There was a lot of young black kids listening to American rap and becoming conscious. So they were all changing their English names and taking on more Afrocentric names. And then I decided to then do this project, I Want to Kill Sam, based off the Ice Cube track that talked about simply of young men going to fight in the Vietnam War, young black men being given these promises. And when they come back, they're treated like second-class citizens. Mm-hmm. And what I did was I took some portraits of some of my friends who were rappers, and I would say really prolific in the community in terms of being extremely conscious. And I had this idea to have them screen printed onto steel. So this is when I was at the Royal College of Art, I was making these pieces. And the whole notion of creating these perforated screen printed images. So when you see the bodies printed on these large metal surfaces, from a distance, you see, a monochromatic black body, standing symmetrically, and they're holding a weapon. And as you get closer to the image, you see the surface. You see it's on metal. It's non-reflective. But more importantly, the closer you get to the image, the more fragmented it is, because it's made up of these very, very fine dots. And I'll never forget when I showed the piece and somebody said that they're consumed by their own abstraction. So the closer you get to the body, the more abstract it becomes. And in some ways, that was the way in which I would view the idea of the black body, that most people, the closer they got to black bodies, I felt the more abstract we became to society. So the Want to Kill Sam was a piece that really talked a lot about the colonization of the black mind. It talked critically about Lord Kitchener, who was a very decorated British general, who slaughtered thousands of North Africans in the Battle of Omdurman. And the Want to Kill Sam 5 pieces surrounded this screen printed coffin with Lord Kitchener's face on it. So, and this piece caused a lot of problems at my degree show. I was told I couldn't show this piece at my degree show at the Royal College of Art. And it was only up until the final week, because I just said, well, if I can't show the piece, then I won't show anything. And they finally, gave in and gave me a small space at the back. And the work was shown, and it was taken up in the art wall. And for me, it was very much looking at the idea of how the black body can be seen in a myriad of contexts, and somehow reclaiming that. Because people say that, the bodies were violent. I said, well, no, they're defending themselves. I don't see them as being violent. I mean, I see images of, and I would make the same comparison with 007 or First Blood, Sylvester Stallone, or Terminator, Schwarzenegger. And there was a way that I would somehow incorporate cinematic elements to the work so that it would be more disarming. So whatever I would present, I would say, well, but there's this other example. If you look at it, why are my figures in One Kill Sam so dangerous, but 007 is loved? What's the difference?
Mm-hmm.
And one is pointing a gun and one is being extremely sexually promiscuous.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? But yet, the way in which they're being interpreted is completely different.
Yeah, that implicit that if a white body is holding a gun, he's a hero and a protector, and if a black body is holding a gun, it's something dangerous.
Absolutely.
So that particular, body of work that you're talking about, the I Want to Kill Sam, that was, of course, using a lyric from an American rapper. Yeah. But you said a lot of your work was about London and about that. But as you said, you have transitioned to the United States about 7 years ago.
Sure.
How has that sort of reflected in your practice?
Right. So I came to the US in '89 as an exchange student. So as I said, that was almost, I came when I was at Boston, Massachusetts. And I came as Paul Duffus. And that's when I went through that transformation, came back, changed my name to Faisal Abdu'Allah, then made the One Kill Sam. And from '89 up until the present day, I'd been going backwards and forwards to the US. And then in 2014, I was asked to apply for a position at UW and was made a professor here. And what I realized is that there is a fascination and an obsession here with race. Mm-hmm. And the thing here is that there are lots of conversations about race. And for me, it can be slightly disheartening when I sit with the Black community, and a lot of those decisions that they make are primarily based through the lens of race. And when I sit with my colleagues in the university, they say, let's have a conversation about race. And I'm like, well, I'm slightly nervous here because I think, we need to move beyond the rhetoric. Mm. And I think the work that I was creating was somehow trying to do that. So I think one of the first pieces I made when I came here was based off the Guardian was doing a website called The Counted, and they were putting up every day the numbers of Black people that had been killed by police. Mm. So this was how many years ago?
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, I began to get fascinated by, numbers. And I'm always numerically superstitious. So I began to screen print these numbers. And almost as if I was just screen printing these numbers there was a white number onto a black background. And it was just the idea of exposing and washing out the screen. Felt very bodily, It's like, creating this screen was almost like creating it's like creating this human being. And then washing out the screen was almost like erasing the human being. So there was some level of mortality for me involved in the way of creating the work. And also, what was really interesting for me is the invisible Black presence within the US. So, as I began to do more research, I began to find out all of these Black inventors, that did these patents. And I began to look around my home and say, oh my God, that ironing board was done by, Boone, the light filament, and, the amber traffic signal. So there's all these things, there's all these kind of invisible kind of achievements by Black excellence that was kind of going unchecked. So I think on one side, there was a discomfort with the over-analyzation and the kind of the overthinking about race. But on the other hand, I think by always putting it at the forefront, it was always something that would somehow help me make an informed decision or a choice on the material, on the purpose, and maybe finding a filtered and conceptual way to talk about these ideas that everybody could access. And in some ways, there was something democratizing that print was able to help me do. So, me creating this, an etching, it meant that the printmakers were intrigued at what this thing was. And they would come in, they'd be pulled in to look at this thing. But then when they were pulled in, then they would see the content, then they would somehow be better informed. So I think I was hoping that, some of those works would have this multi-layer in terms of a kind of a visual, aesthetic that had a kind of a certain technical proficiency, but somehow historically took them through a certain kind of more informed process. So I guess one of the pieces that I did here that I think really stands up is the sculpture. I made a piece called the Barber Chair. And essentially, as I was saying about my early years of growing up in London and the barbershop being my first institute of education, began to think about how how the formative years had really informed my life, and created this 24 karat gold barber chair, as a way of looking at, this porthole of empirical importance that had formed my identity, and it also being a space or a platform that people were able to transform themselves. Yeah. So, for me, it was almost like, and my practice as a barber, because I would cut hair when I was a student and continue to cut hair throughout my student life, and I still have a barbershop in London. The practice of cutting hair for everyone is almost a way in which people can be the best version of themselves. And, the way in which people come in as one thing and leave as another. So me, it was almost like, talking about the importance of that.
Yeah, and I know that you also did a performance too, and I don't think it was with the gold barber chair, but it was a performance where you actually be cutting hair, because you're not just someone who's interested in the cultural place of the barbershop, but you've been sort of a practicing barber as well, like with the skills for that too.
Yeah, I mean, I was asked by Jessica Vorsanger, who was the partner of Bob and Roberta Smith years ago, to do a lecture for her university at Kent. But she then said, but you have to perform it. And I says, I don't do performances. I just come and speak, and I can play some music. She said, no. Can you perform it? I said, no, I can't do it. And she was steadfast. She kept emailing me and said, look, we'd love you to perform it. I said, well, what can I do? I can't sing. I can't dance. I'm doing any of those things. But she says, well, you cut hair, don't you? I says, yeah, but why would I come and do that? She says, well, can you perform it? I says, I could do it with my eyes closed, and give a lecture at the same time. She says, yeah, that would be great. So I turned up at Kent, and I think that day my son was sick. So he came with me. So he was the model in the chair. And we had these about 15 students sitting around me in a circle. And I just started talking about my work, and there were no slides. It's just me visually telling them, not visually, but me speaking to them in kind of visual terms to describe the work. And it just felt like an informal barbershop. And we spoke for an hour strong, and it just kind of really worked. And from that point on, I think Jessica then asked me to do it again in the British Art Show at the Hayward Gallery. And they called it Live Salon. And from that point on, Live Salon came into existence. And it was just a way of looking at the barber shop, looking at the cutting of hair, looking at the experience of transforming oneself through different life experiences. So people would come into the barber shop if they got a divorce to get a haircut.
Right. The breakup bangs or breakup fringe, like that's famous.
There you go. The breakup. And then, the married cut, the divorce cut. There were all different types of cuts that people would have. And for me, I would say that when I was working in the shop, I would travel the world 9 times a day by hearing people's different life stories. And I guess there was some level of confidentiality that we have to keep. And I found that I began to take a lot of that stuff with me. So spiritually, when I would go to the shop, you take all that stuff for the day and you almost like bring it home. So I had to go through almost like a process of cleansing when I get home by taking my clothes off at the door and then going straight upstairs for a shower, just to take the weight of the day off me. So for me, the barbershop, live salon was a really, really important because it looked at that kind of that terrain that everyone understands. And I always find that when I'm cutting hair, performing it in a live salon, or doing the live salon performance in a school, when people walk past, they always stop. They always stop and smile. And if they stop and smile, they will come back and they will sit and just want to listen. And I think that's something that it's something that I think we all understand. We all understand what it means to be waiting, to be transformed. We all understand what it means that we're reliant on somebody to make us be the best version of ourselves. We kind of understand that hair is a form of artistry, and I think in particularly for the Black community, it foregrounds issues around race and politics. And also, it becomes an interesting safe space for that Black community, because I know in the 70s, that was the only place that the immigrant community would go and sit and could talk candidly about their current life and get advice. And I think a lot of that has gone now, but it did actually make me into the person I am now, and still find the notion of community really, really important.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So for the last little bit that I've got you here, I'm going to ask you to switch gears a little bit and from talking about your own practice to talking about another role that you have, which is you're currently the president for the Southern Graphics Council International. And relatively recently, I think in maybe recent months, that you stepped into the role. And, I know basically that every printmaker I talked to were super saddened by the cancellation of SGCI 2020 that was going to be in Puerto Rico. But of course, anyone with any sense completely understands why. But I know that yearly meetup, that exchange of ideas, it is the highlight of the year for so many people, particularly printmakers who are working outside of major metropolitan areas where maybe they don't have that collective community. Can you speak to us about the prospects of SGCI 2021 at this point? If we know if that's going to happen or not, or what it might look like, and if it doesn't happen physically, any kind of supplemental programming you can drop some hints about?
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely drop some hints.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure because we know so little now. I'm sure it's just
Yeah.
everything's very much up in the air. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there will be some communications going out in the next week or so about the conferences. I think the most important thing is that I think myself as an artist, I value the safety and the health and well-being of people, and more so our members. And I think it was definitely the right move. It was sad, but I think knowing that our members are safe and well is really important. I think in the next week or so there'll be some updates on what we have planned for 2021. I think it will be exciting. There are a lot of things that we are talking about doing for our members. We've had to listen a lot to a lot of their comments and their suggestions, and I think the organization, from 1972, has done some amazing things. And what we're doing, we are trying to make ourselves extremely relevant and accountable at the same time. So we're listening to the kind of ideas that our members are suggesting. And for 21, there will definitely be some kind of event. We're going to also be telling you about 22, 23, and 24. For me, that's what I've been working really hard on, in giving the members, not just bad news, but news that has solutions. So we will say, yes, this conference is going to happen in this format. In 22, this is going to happen. In 23, this is going to happen. In 24, this is going to happen. So there's going to be a lot of information that we're going to be disseminating to our members within, I'd say, a week from now.
Excellent. Well, we will definitely all look forward to hearing that. And so, I think that as you said, that there's been people who've been offering feedback, and SGCI has been taking that into account and responding to it. And I think that being critical of our institutions and our collectives are always really important to make sure that everyone is being accountable and we're always evolving. But is there anything printmakers can do to sort of help SGCI at this time as well? Because it is something that, like I said, and I think like many people would agree with, those conferences mean so much. I've made incredible friendships there. I'm actually living in Bangkok now because of one of those conferences. At SGCI San Francisco, I met the amazing Thai printmaker Kitty Kong, and through our friendship and our professional relationship, I ended up with a job offer at a gallery here in Bangkok. Like, they've changed my life fundamentally. And so while being critical is important, and I'm glad that SGCI is open to this dialogue, is there anything we can do to help, and to help at a time when all kinds of organizations are struggling, to help sort of come together and support each other and make sure that we still get to reap the benefits of this institution?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that I would hope the members still have faith in the organization and the board. And, serving on the board is a thankless task. And because we do it because we love the organization and we love printmaking. I mean, I think they need to understand that we are artists first and foremost. And we're going to try and pull the levers always in favor of the artist. And I think the second thing is that, I think the critique is important, but I think I would love for them to also provide the solution. So if you can write a 3-page email critiquing, then surely you can write a page email to say, well, actually, this is how we can solve it. Mm-hmm. And I would urge some of the members who really want to see change, again, in a week or so, we're going to be advertising for spaces on the board. So there will be spaces opening up for people to join the board and see and be a part of the change that they want to see in the organization. So for me, it's almost like I want members to be more involved in the board. I need to hear their voices, and we need to kind of understand what are we missing? Because when you think about this, is that, I'm of a certain generation, our members are of a certain generation. So there are things that I may miss, and there are things that they may miss. And it's important that we're able to have this conversation in that void, when we can say, this is what's actually relevant now, and therefore it may have been relevant when you were, 25, but this is what we think is kind of really important. And I think having that civil discussion and exchange, I think, is going to be really, really important. So I think those are the things that I would just really are at the forefront of my mind in terms of how I think we can pull the organization to a place that, we're kind of comfortable. And I think the next conferences are going to be really, really amazing. There's one for 2022 and 23, 24, and even 21. I mean, we've got some really amazing kind of ideas and things that we're going to do, which are going to be more member centric.
Beautiful. Yeah, I just realized as you were talking, kind of about the different generations and how that intergenerational exchange and community building that happens is really beautiful. And it's an element of SGCI conferences I haven't thought of before, in that, as, I'm in my mid-30s, and most of the people I interact with in the arts world are sort of more or less in my cohort. And I'm getting to the point now where I meet younger artists who I have more of a sort of mentorship role to, but it's just beginning. And then anyone who's the generation above me, whenever I meet them, there's a more of a professional power dynamic at play. Like they're the director of a museum I'm really trying to get some work into or something. So the fact that we all can meet together socially in these ways is really significant. And I've had some wonderful exchanges of ideas that there's just not really a place for in this world outside of a situation like sitting in a conference bar or getting tea after a talk. We just don't come across these opportunities to have that in-person connection really any other times. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, for us, I think that's something that we want to try and work on. So maybe, we're reviewing the conference model. I mean, I said we've done this so many times. Maybe there are other ways that we can do it. Maybe there are smaller, maybe there are mini conferences. One of the things that I'm really keen, and as you know, community is everything. And I think it's really important in my tenure that whatever we do really brings the community to the room, that, the community is, a part of this conference. And there are resources, there are awards that look at, bringing the community into our organization, but also youth. I don't know if there is enough that we have done in the past that brings in, supports a 15, 16-year-old printmaker.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that we can do to do that? So we're looking at other creative ways of trying to reach out to maybe, artists and scholars just like yourself who know younger printmakers, and maybe bringing them into the fold, or maybe finding a tier system, a way of bringing them in and introducing them into print. Because my understanding is that print is not really taught a lot in schools.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a way that we can start to gain that kind of awareness and that kind of presence. And SGC has a strong enough reputation to try and, kickstart something like that.
Absolutely. And the kids these days, they are so smart. Like a 16-year-old today is so much smarter than I was at 16, 20 years ago. They're so engaged and critical and creative and doing incredible things with technology and new media that I can't even begin to think about. So I would love to see more of that and more of just that energy and creativity in an organization like SGC. So I'm very happy to hear that all of that is on your mind. Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, having buy-in as well, knowing that members can step forward and say, hey, I'm interested in the idea of that thing around community, and maybe we can think about doing this thing across, 3 countries or 3 shops or 3 schools. So this is where, we need our members who are globally, even like yourself, to start to bring those kind of ideas to the table. And we're open for collaboration. I think that's really, really important.
Wonderful. Well, could any listeners take that as an open invitation and call to action to start thinking creatively about what they can do wherever they are in the world?
I said it before and I'll say it again, moving beyond rhetoric, that if somebody really has an idea, they know my email, please reach out to me. I mean, in my first month as president, I had to put out a lot of fires, and a lot of the emails I got were hot. The emails were coming in hot. Mm-hmm. I think the emails now are coming a lot cooler. And I think there are some really beautiful ideas coming through and some wonderful emails of support from the members. So I do feel we're in a really, really good place. And for me, I try to work slow and steadily, and at heart always keep the artists at the center, because that's my only thing, is to keep them at the center. So I'm open to kind of ideas, suggestions of ways of how we can, bring print to the wider community and to a younger community.
Beautiful. Well, I feel like that is a great place to wrap up with that invitation and those words of hope. And want to thank you for taking an hour out of your morning to chat with me. And it's been just a real pleasure learning more about your practice and hearing some great words about the future of SGC. And I'm really happy that you're there, breathing some life into things and engaging with the community, because I know it's something that's really important to all of us. So thank you for your service in that as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, man. It's great to be on the show.
Wonderful. Well, I will be in touch with you when I know the podcast coming out. I'm going to try and probably get it out pretty quickly, just because I know things, the more time people have to listen to it and think about it, hopefully the more responses you get, and the more time people have to start thinking about what they can do in the coming years. So I'll let you know though when it's coming out.
Yeah, great. And again, it's been great speaking to you, and and some of the things that we spoke about today, I've only been thinking about them. So it's nice. I think it's always nice to just open up a different part of your kind of brain and be challenged. You've asked some really incredible questions that I'd never thought about, especially around my school, my early years. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you for being so open. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to hopefully maybe collaborating on something. If I can do SGC Bangkok something, I don't know. You've got me like excited about possibilities. So I hope we can stay in touch.
No, without a doubt. Honestly, I'm seriously thinking about, the satellite is important. Just some kind of satellite project where we're in different places. And, let's stay in touch.
Absolutely, because like printmaking in Thailand is amazing. Like it's
Really?
just all young, incredibly talented people starting their own print shops, starting their own publishing studios. And Thailand doesn't have like a print tradition. It's very unusual. Like it doesn't have sort of a native print tradition. So they've only been working here really since the 1970s. It's fascinating here. So anytime I get a chance to show off the beautiful things happening in Thailand, it really moves me because they're doing incredible things here that the world should see. So maybe we can start thinking about that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to hold you to that. That's I'm making a note in my book because I don't do virtual stuff. I always have a physical diary. Mm-hmm. So I write stuff down. So I'm making a note of that. So I'm going to hold you to that.
Sounds good. I would be happy to do like a virtual tour, an artist talk, or something. Yeah. Sounds good.
Maybe that forms part of the 21 thing. We'll see. I'll be in touch.
Sounds great. Well, thank you again, Faisal, and have a beautiful day.
You too. Take care. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Sean Star Wars. Sean is a beloved woodcut artist who is known for breaking all the rules with his prolific and pop culture-inspired practice. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.